The head judge crossed his arms and laughed the way men laugh when they have already decided the outcome and just want witnesses. He said it loud enough for the three nearest benches to hear, loud enough that the sound carried over the smell of fresh cedar shavings and old machine oil that hung in the air of the Rivière-du-Loup Regional Woodworking Championship every September without fail. "Sir, with respect, I've been running this competition for 11 years and I have never once seen a hand tool entry place in the joinery division. The tolerances we're measuring to are a 1/4 millimetre. 1/4 millimetre, sir. The fellows with the CNC rigs spend 6 months dialing those machines in just to hit that mark consistently. A hand plane and a marking gauge are wonderful things, truly, but this isn't 1960. He gestured at the canvas roll of chisels and the wooden smoothing plane sitting on the bench in front of the old man, at the worn leather tool roll and the small brass marking gauge and the hand saw in its cracked leather scabbard that looked like it had been resoled more than once by a man who did not throw useful things away. You are more than welcome to compete. We score everybody the same. But I would hate for you to drive home feeling like the tools let you down when really it's just a different era, you understand." He smiled. It was a kind smile, or it was shaped like one. "Tell you what, you produce a dovetail joint in that white oak that closes to under a 1/4 millimetre on all 4 corners, and I will personally buy coffee and donuts for every competitor in this hall. How does that sound?" The old man in the flannel shirt had not smiled and had not frowned. He looked down at the piece of 8/4 white oak on the bench in front of him and then back up at the head judge, and he said, very quietly, "I'll hold you to that, son. If you believe that a man who has spent 60 years learning one thing at a profound level does not owe anyone an explanation of his credentials, type the word craft in the comments before we go any further, because you are about to watch a head judge learn the kind of lesson that takes root and does not let go." His name was Rémi Gaudreault, and at 73 years old he moved through the exhibition hall of the Centre Communautaire de Rivière-du-Loup, the way a man moves when he has been on his feet since before the sun came up and has no intention of sitting down before the work is done. He was not a large man, and the years had taken some width from his shoulders that they had replaced with a kind of settled stillness. The stillness of a pond in the early morning when there is no wind and the surface tells you nothing about the depth. He wore a flannel shirt the colour of old spruce bark pressed at the collar and a pair of dark canvas work trousers with a heavy leather apron folded under his arm that he had not yet put on. His hands, when he set the apron on the bench and began unrolling the canvas toolkit, were the hands of a man who had spent a life in wood. The knuckles were wide. The fingertips were flat and calloused in the specific way that comes only from decades of holding a marking gauge and feeling for the line with your skin before you ever look with your eye. The tool roll, when he spread it on the bench, held 9 chisels of graduated width, each one ground to a bevel so consistent it looked machined, each one with a handle that had been turned on a foot-powered lathe by Rémi's own father in a garage in Bay St. Paul in 1961. The plane was a Stanley No. 4 that had been refurbished so many times the casting had taken on the smooth grey lustre of old pewter. The saw was a Diston Rip saw, vintage 1958, with a handle of apple wood that had been cracked once and repaired with a single tight wrap of brass wire in a way that looked, if you were paying attention, like deliberate jewellery rather than a fix. But almost nobody in the Rivière-du-Loup Regional Woodworking Championship that September morning was paying that kind of attention. They were watching their CNC timers and their moisture meter readouts, and the digital callipers clipped to their belts, and the few who had noticed Rémi Gaudreault at bench 14 had noticed him the way you notice a person who has clearly wandered into the wrong room and hasn't realized it yet. The head judge that year was a 34-year-old named Jason Hebert. Jason had been woodworking competitively since his mid-20s, which in the current era of the sport meant he had grown up with CNC technology the way earlier generations grew up with the table saw, as a tool so foundational. You stopped thinking of it as technology and started thinking of it as simply the way things were done. He ran the Rivière-du-Loup competition with the crisp authority of a man who liked systems and trusted them, who believed that the highest expression of the craft was precision, and that precision in the modern era meant computer-controlled repeatability. He was not wrong about this exactly, but he had the particular limitation that comes to men who have been right about something important. Long enough, that they stop checking whether there are things their framework doesn't account for. He had seen Rémi sign in at the registration table that morning, had watched the old man pay the entry fee in cash from a small envelope, and had made the same quiet calculation that men like him make about men like Rémi without ever quite deciding to make it. He had filed him under heritage demonstrator and moved on. Not a threat to the scoreboard, not really here to compete, here to show the old ways, which was fine, which was even good for the atmosphere of the event, but which was not going to trouble the judges' table. What Jason Hebert did not know, as he walked down the row of benches with his clipboard and his easy, proprietary smile, was that bench 14 had once been occupied by a different kind of man entirely. Not the quiet retiree he was looking at now. A man who had learned to read wood grain the way a sniper reads wind, who had spent 3 years after his discharge from the Canadian Forces making furniture in a Quonset-style workshop behind a small house in the eastern townships, because it was the only thing that kept his hands steady, who had later spent 20 years teaching fine woodworking at a college in Sherbrooke, where his students had placed in national competitions 11 times, who had published exactly one article in his entire life, a 12-page piece in a trade journal in 1989 about the geometry of hand-cut dovetails in pre-industrial Quebec furniture, which remained, 35 years later, the most cited source on the subject in French Canada. Rémi Gaudreault did not carry copies of this article. He did not bring certificates. He did not mention Sherbrooke or the journal or the 11 national placements, because it had never once occurred to him that any of this was something a person needed to mention. He had come to Rivière-du-Loup because his daughter lived 30 minutes away and he was visiting for the long weekend, and because he had seen the flyer for the competition on the door of the hardware store on Thursday and thought it might be a pleasant way to spend a Saturday morning. He had loaded his tools into the truck the way he always loaded them, rolled in their canvas, secured with the single leather strap he'd cut from an old belt in 1987, and he had driven to the exhibition hall and paid his $25 and found bench 14 and begun setting up without thinking too hard about any of it, because this was what he did, and he did not require an occasion. The 3 woodworkers at the nearest benches had stopped paying attention to their own setups, sometime around the moment Rémi unrolled his chisels. There was something about watching a man prepare his tools who has been preparing those tools for 50 years. It has the quality of ceremony even when no ceremony is intended. The hands know where everything goes without looking. The sequence has a rhythm that is not performed. A younger woodworker at bench 12, a man in his early 30s, who ran a furniture studio in Montreal and who had driven up for the competition with a custom-built portable CNC unit in the back of his van, had set down his laptop and was watching Rémi's hands with the careful, slightly disoriented expression of someone who has just heard a piece of music they have never encountered before. It was at that point that Jason Hebert arrived with his clipboard. "Good morning, sir. Rémi, is it? I'm Jason. I'm running the match today. That is a beautiful set of tools you've brought with you. Are those the original handles on those chisels?" "My father turned them," Rémi said. He did not look up from the edge. He was checking on the number 4's blade with the flat of his thumb. Jason paused. That was not the answer he had prepared a response to. He turned them himself. Remarkable. Well, he resettled his clipboard. "I want to make sure you're clear on the scoring this year, because we've tightened the tolerances in the joinery division. We're measuring fit gaps with a digital caliper accurate to 1/100th of a millimetre, and the passing threshold for a competitive entry in the dovetail class is 1/4 millimetre or less on all corner contacts. That's a very demanding standard, and it's one that even our CNC entries don't always hit. So I want to be upfront with you that if you're here to demonstrate the hand tool tradition, which is genuinely valued and which we've loved having represented in this competition, the scoring rubric may not fully reflect what you're doing. Do you follow what I'm saying?" "I follow you," Rémi said. "Great. And you're planning to work in white oak. I see. 8/4. I dried it myself, 12 months in the shed." Jason blinked. 12 months of air drying for a competition piece was not something a person mentioned casually. It was not something a person did casually. It meant that Rémi Gaudreault had looked at the competition flyer in a hardware store on Thursday and had thought, "I have a piece of 8/4 white oak that has been waiting in my shed for a year, which I will now bring to Rivière-du-Loup." The wood had been ready before the occasion announced itself. But Jason had already built his story about bench 14, and a single data point was not enough to pull it down. He pressed on. Wonderful. I love that kind of commitment to process. I just want to be honest with you, between us, that white oak at 8/4 is an extremely demanding wood for hand tools. The grain reversal in that species can catch a hand plane and tear out in a way that will kill your surface quality. And in the joinery division, we score surface quality right alongside fit tolerance. The fellows with the power planers and the cabinet scrapers, they can recover a tear out in about 90 seconds. By hand, once it's gone, it's gone. Rémi set the plane down. He looked up at Jason for the first time, and Jason experienced a brief, involuntary sensation of having said something that revealed more about himself than it did about the subject under discussion. "I know white oak," Rémi said. He said it the way a man says something that is entirely factual and has no interest in being anything more than factual. The woodworker at bench 12 had stopped pretending to look at his laptop. Jason still had his clipboard, and he still had his roll, and the hall was full enough that there were a dozen eyes on this exchange from various angles, and he was not yet ready to let the story go. He was 34 years old, and he had been running this competition for 11 years, and he had seen a lot of heritage demonstrators, and he had been kind to all of them, and he meant to be kind to this one too. "Sir, tell you what," he said. "If you produce a dovetail joint in that white oak that measures under 1/4 millimetre on all four corners, I will personally buy coffee and donuts for every single competitor in this hall. How does that sound? Deal?" And Rémi Gaudreault looked at him for a moment with the level, unreadable attention of a man who has had a great many things said to him in his life and has learned to let almost all of them pass through without sticking. "I'll hold you to that, son," he said, and looked back at his plain iron. The woodworker at bench 12 picked up his phone. Rémi put on his leather apron. He tied the strings in a knot at the back, the same knot his wife Colette had tied for him every morning for 31 years before she had stopped being able to, and that he had been tying himself for the 9 years since. He settled his marking gauge and his sliding bevel and his shop-made layout square on the bench in the order he always used, left to right, the order his own teacher had suggested to him in a workshop in Laval in 1974, and that he had never found a reason to change. He took the piece of 8/4 white oak in both hands and turned it slowly under the exhibition hall's fluorescent lights, reading the grain the way a man reads a long-known text, not looking for information but confirming what he already knows and checking for anything that might have changed since last he looked. He had cut the blank in July. He had dressed it to dimension in August. He had let it sit through September in his truck shed, wrapped in brown paper, because white oak at 8/4 in the eastern townships has a particular way of moving in the dry heat of late summer, and a man who knows his wood knows to let it finish its settling before he brings it indoors and asks it to hold a line. He had measured it again in the morning before he'd driven to his daughter's house and found it within 2/100ths of a millimetre on every face. He had made a small mark in pencil on the end grain, his initials, the date, and a small number that represented the equilibrium moisture content he had measured that morning with a pin meter, because he tracked these things the way other men track mileage, because the information mattered and writing it down cost nothing. He squared his stance, set the marking gauge to 7/16, and ran the baseline. The cut was so clean and so consistent that the woodworker at bench 12, who had come around to watch from an angle where he could see the surface, later said it looked like a line drawn with a ruling pen rather than a cutting tool. Then Rémi Gaudreault laid out his dovetail angles with a sliding bevel set to a 1:8 ratio, marked the pins in pencil with the edge of a chisel, and picked up his saw. There is a particular sound a well-tuned handsaw makes in dry white oak when it is held correctly and drawn at the right angle. It is not a tearing sound and it is not a grinding sound. It is a sound almost like fabric, a long, even whisper, cut for cut, with no variation in pressure and no hesitation at the end of the stroke. The woodworker from Montreal had heard that sound before, once in a video of a Japanese hand tool competition that had been filmed in the 1990s and uploaded to YouTube by someone's grandson. He had not expected to hear it in person in Rivière-du-Loup on a Saturday morning in September. The people around bench 14 had gone quiet. Rémi did not acknowledge the quiet. He worked at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, the pace of a man who has done a thing so many times that his body knows exactly how much effort each step requires and allocates no more and no less. He cut his pins, he chopped his waist with the chisels in 3 passes, never forcing. The mallet hits metered out with the same patience with which a stonemason sets a face. He transferred the pin pattern to the tailboard with a marking knife, whose handle, if anyone had asked, had been made from a piece of figured maple he had taken from a tree that fell in a storm on his property in 1998. No one asked. The dovetails came together with no mallet. He pressed them with the heels of his hands, slowly, the way you close a book you are not finished with, and they seated with the quiet, solid resistance of a well-fitted joint and stopped with all 4 corners flush. Jason Heber was not in the main hall anymore. Jason Hebert was standing at the judging table at the far end of the hall, not watching bench 14, because he had told himself he was not going to hover and make the old man feel scrutinized, which was a kind thing to think, and which had the secondary advantage of meaning he did not have to watch the process from close up. But when the sound of the handsaw and the mallet stopped, and the hall did not return to its usual level of noise, Jason became aware of the silence in the way you become aware of a smell. Not all at once, but in a slow crescendo until it is all you can sense. He looked up. The people at the 4 nearest benches were standing back from their own work. The Montreal woodworker was still beside bench 14, and he was holding his phone up, and he was not making a call. The 2 judges' assistants who had been doing preliminary measurement rounds had both stopped and were looking in the same direction, and one of them was holding her digital caliper at her side with the jaws open as though she had interrupted herself mid-measurement and forgotten to finish. Jason walked toward bench 14. Rémi had set the assembled joint on the bench. He had stepped back and was examining it from 2 angles, tilting his head slightly in the manner of a man who is not performing inspection but actually inspecting. Then he turned to the judging assistant who had come to stand nearest. "I believe I'm ready for measurement," he said. The assistant, a woman in her late 40s named Claudette, who had been judging at woodworking competitions in the lower St. Lawrence region for 15 years, picked up her caliper and bent over the joint. She measured the first corner. She straightened up. She measured it again. Then she moved to the second corner, and the third and the fourth. After the 4th measurement she stood up and was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Gaudreault," she said, "can I ask you to hold that joint flat on the bench for a moment?" He held it. She took a fibre optic inspection light from her judging kit and ran it along all 4 corner contacts. Then she set the light down and wrote 4 numbers on her judging sheet, and she held the sheet up and showed it to the second judge. And the second judge leaned in and looked at the numbers, and then looked at the joint, and then looked at Rémi, and said something in a low voice that was not meant to carry. It carried. "Claudette, that's not possible." "I know," she said. Jason Hebert was standing at the end of bench 14 now. He was looking at the joint, and he was not saying anything, and the smile that had been the natural resting expression of his face all morning had gone somewhere that was not coming back at its own pace. Claudette turned toward him with her judging sheet. "Jason, all 4 corners are under 1/10 of a millimetre. The average fit gap is 8/100ths. This is the tightest hand-cut dovetail I have personally measured in 15 years of judging this division. The surface quality on both boards is—" She paused and looked at the boards again, and then said simply, "I don't have a mark on my rubric for this." The hall was very quiet now, not the polite quiet of people pretending to work. The quiet of people who have stopped pretending. Jason Hebert looked at Rémi Gaudreault. Rémi was untying his apron. He had the apron half folded over his arm, and he was waiting with the patient expression of a man who has no particular need for what comes next. It was at that moment that the door at the end of the hall opened, and a man in his late 60s came in. He was not tall, but he moved with the self-possession of someone accustomed to rooms and to managing what happens in them. He wore a barn jacket and carried a manila envelope that was brown at the edges with age. He walked directly toward bench 14 without looking at the registration desk or the judges' table or the banner across the entrance that said "Bienvenue au Championnat Régional." He walked as a man walks to a place he has already decided to go. He stopped 6 feet from Rémi Gaudreault, and he stood to attention, and he said in a voice that was not loud but that had a quality of clarity that went through the ambient noise of the hall the way a tuning fork cuts through background sound, "Sergeant Gaudreault, Capitaine Retraité Pierre Fossier, Royal 22E Régiment. Permission to approach, Sergeant." Something moved in Rémi's face. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Something that happens when a name from a sealed room in your memory is spoken aloud by someone who was also in that room. Pierre, he said. How did you find me here? Mark Deschaines at bench 12 called me 20 minutes ago. Said there was a man at bench 14 with a set of chisels that had been turned in Bayeux St. Paul and a piece of white oak he'd dried himself, and that I would want to see what happened next. I was in Kakuna already. I was in my truck in 4 minutes. He turned then and he looked at Jason Hebert, and his expression did not harden exactly. It became precise, the way a tool becomes precise when it has been ground to its final edge. Is your name Jason Hebert? Yes, sir. I understand you made a wager with this man this morning about a 1/4 millimetre. Jason's jaw moved once. Yes, sir. Do you know who this man is? A pause. No, sir, I don't. Capitaine. Fortier opened the manila envelope. He removed 3 sheets of paper and a photograph, and he held them in a way that said he had carried them a long time and knew exactly what was in them. This man is Sergeant Rémi Gaudreault, Royal 22e Régiment, retired. He enlisted in 1971. He completed his initial training at CFB Valcartier and served 2 tours in Cyprus on UN peacekeeping missions in the mid-70s. During his second tour in October of 1976, a situation developed at an observation post on the buffer zone between Nicosia and Kyrenia that I'm going to describe in general terms, only because Sergeant Gaudreault has never described it at all, to my knowledge, and it is not my story to tell in full. He paused. There were 6 men at that post, including a 22-year-old corporal named Pierre Forcier, who had been in country for 11 weeks and who had made a decision in the hour before that, under pressure, that had put those 6 men in a position that was difficult to get out of. Sergeant Gaudreault did not comment on the decision. He did not raise his voice. He assessed the situation with a clearness of mind that I have spent 47 years trying to understand, and he made the calls that needed to be made, and all 6 men came home. He received a commendation that he accepted politely and has never mentioned to any person I have spoken to who knows him personally. The hall had gone very still. One of the CNC units at the far end was still running, its spindle making a low, even hum, and nobody moved to stop it. After his discharge, Forcier continued, Sergeant Gaudreault spent 3 years making furniture in a workshop in the eastern townships before beginning a 20-year teaching career in fine woodworking at a college in Sherbrooke. His students placed in national competition 11 times. He published 1 piece of scholarship. In 1989, that is still the primary reference on pre-industrial Quebec joinery in the French language literature. He came here this morning because his daughter lives in Saint-Antonin and he saw a flyer in a hardware store on Thursday. Forcier refolded the papers. He looked at Jason Hebert. Son, you looked at an old man in a flannel shirt with a worn tool roll and a piece of air-dried white oak, and you built a story about him inside of 30 seconds, and you committed to it publicly, and you were wrong about every piece of it. I am not here to embarrass you. Sergeant Gaudreault would not want that, and I would not do it in his presence. But I am going to say one thing. He said it. You are standing in front of a man who has forgotten more about wood and about what it means to do something with your hands at the highest level than the best competitor in this hall will accumulate in a career. He did not come here to prove that to you. He came here because the work is its own reason, and it always has been for him, and he does not require an audience or a context to make it worth doing. You very nearly made this morning smaller than it deserved to be. The only reason it was not smaller is because this man is larger than the frame you put him in, and because a young woodworker at bench 12 recognized something and made a phone call. Jason Hebert's face had gone the color of unfinished pine. His eyes were wet at the corners. He looked at Rémi. Sergeant Gaudreault, he said, I owe you an apology, a real one. I looked at your tools and I decided I already knew what I was seeing, and I ran my mouth in front of this whole room, and I was completely wrong. I'm sorry, sir. I'm genuinely sorry. Rémi Gaudreault looked at Jason Hebert for a long, quiet moment. The kind of moment that is not uncomfortable when the person holding it is not uncomfortable. Then he said, Jason, nobody cut a hand off. You're going to be all right. He reached out and put his hand on the younger man's forearm, briefly, the way a man touches someone when the words are secondary to the contact. I ran a workshop for 20 years. I made mistakes in front of my students more than once. The skill is to hear the lesson while it's happening and not wait until later. You're hearing it right now. That's most of it. Jason nodded. A single line moved down his face, and he did not look away from Rémi to hide it. Rémi did not enter the afternoon session of the competition. He had made his joint, and the joint had been measured, and that was sufficient. He sat in a folding chair beside bench 14, with Capitaine Forcier in a chair beside him, and the two men talked in the low, easy way of people who have known each other across a distance of decades and do not need to cover the ground quickly. Mark Deschaines from bench 12 brought 3 cups of coffee from the machine near the entrance and pulled up an equipment case to sit on, and the three of them talked about wood and about weather and about a man named Boisvert who had served with them, both in Cyprus, and who was now, apparently, running a sugar bush operation near St. Agathe that was either very successful or a disaster, depending on the year. Competitors came over, one by one, through the morning. A young woman who had just finished her Red Seal exam in cabinet making asked very quietly whether she could take a photograph of the chisels. Rémi thought about it for a moment and then unrolled the canvas toolkit on the bench and told her to take as many as she wanted, and she took 7, and later that week she would post them to a cabinet-making forum with a caption that said only, "Chisels turned by the maker's father in Bay St. Paul, 1961. Handles are still true. The man who owns them cut a dovetail in 8-quarter white oak this morning that measured 8/100ths of a millimetre average gap. I was there." The post was shared more than 8,000 times. Rémi did not know about this, because Rémi was not on the forum and had no plans to be. At noon, Jason Hebert drove to the Tim Hortons on Boulevard Cartier and then to the bakery 2 doors down and came back with a cardboard box of donuts and a carrier of large coffees, and he walked to bench 14 and held out the first cup with both hands. "Sergeant Gaudreault." "Coffee, sir." Rémi took the cup. He held it for a moment. The faintest edge of something crossed his expression, the thing that appears at the corner of a man's mouth when he has been given exactly what he had expected and finds he still appreciates it. "Thank you, son. Pull up something and drink with us." Jason sat on an overturned milk crate. He stayed for an hour and a half, and he did not say very much, but he listened to everything, and he left different from how he had arrived. Rémi Gaudreault drove back to his daughter's house that evening, with the canvas tool roll on the seat beside him, and the piece of white oak now joined, wrapped in brown paper on the floor of the passenger side. He had given the joined piece to Mark Deschaines, who had admired it the longest and the most quietly. He had not planned to give it away. But a thing made with that much care and attention belongs in a place where care and attention are recognized, and Mark had recognized it. He carried his tools into his daughter's kitchen, untied the canvas, and went through each chisel with a fine stone before wrapping them again. He did not do this because they had been dulled, had not, but because this was how you kept an edge across a lifetime, not by sharpening when necessary, but by tending as a matter of course. His daughter sat at the kitchen table and watched him work. She had seen this ritual all her life, and it still settled something in her to see it. "Good day?" she asked. Rémi ran his thumb along the flat of the last chisel and rolled it into the canvas. "Decent day," he said. In the weeks that followed, Jason Hebert drove up to Rivière-du-Loup twice to see Rémi at his daughter's house during the latter's extended visit, because his daughter had said he should stay, and he had decided, without making a production of the decision, that she was right. They sat in the small workshop behind the house, which Rémi had cleaned and organized in the first 3 days of his stay, with the quiet efficiency of a man who cannot occupy a space without making it functional. And Rémi showed Jason things about white oak and hard maple and the geometry of the hand-cut joint that Jason had not understood existed to be learned. Jason's joints tightened over the autumn by a margin that surprised his own students when he began passing the knowledge along, which he did, because that is what you do with knowledge that comes from somewhere deep. And on a Thursday morning in late November, at the Community Woodworking Co-op, Jason ran on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in the basement of a church hall in Rivière-du-Loup. A young man came in with a set of tools that had clearly been assembled from garage sales and second-hand shops. A plane with a bent lever cap, chisels with no secondary bevel, a saw that needed setting. He stood at the door, holding the tool bag, with the look of a person who has made the effort to arrive and is not sure what to do with it. Jason Hebert walked over. He took the bag, set it on a bench, and opened it. He went through the tools one by one without hurrying, without commenting on their condition, with the focused attention of a man to whom the tools in front of him are worth his full regard. Then he set them on the bench in order, largest to smallest. "We'll get these sorted out first," he said. "Then I'll show you something your grandfather's grandfather would have known, and almost nobody does anymore. He put his hand on the young man's shoulder for a moment. "You showed up," he said. "That's the hard part." The young man's hands on the edge of the bench steadied, and Jason Heber pulled up 2 stools and laid a piece of clear white ash across the bench between them, and the work began.